just going to welcome everyone again to this webinar about medical assistance in dying. We're really hoping to provide you with a comprehensive webinar that really is going to explore how MAiD is defined, eligibility, access, ethical considerations, and then we're going to follow up with a bit of a discussion on some of maybe the common concerns that we hear from our community, as well as answer any questions that you might have had either through the forum or through the chat. And I'm going to get started just by introducing Heather Lamb, who is, as probably many of you know, our Infoline specialist, and she's going to be leading this session. But also we have Bert, Abbott, and Scott Heron that are joining us as well to have the discussion at the end with Heather.
All right, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our Medical Assistance in Dying webinar. So we know that this is a controversial topic and that our members are talking about it. So we're doing this webinar to provide you with factual information about what the program is, who may or may not be eligible, and some of the ethical considerations that many people have brought up around the program. We know that some of you might be interested in MAiD, either now or in the future, and we know that some of you are strongly opposed to MAiD. We respect the opinions of all of our members, regardless of what decisions you make, what emotions you have around it. So we're doing this so that we can help to support people to make decisions that work for you based on that factual information. Some of you may have peer connections who are talking about MAiD, may have gone through it, or may be strongly opposed to it as well. So this will give you some information to better navigate those conversations with your peers. As an organization, we're not in favor of MAiD, nor are we completely against it. What we want is for people to be supported in making decisions. And we want to share what we're hearing from our networks. So we are going to have a presentation first from me about the eligibility for MAiD and what it is and isn't, and then we'll go into a conversation with Bert and Scott about what we're hearing from our peer members. So next slide, please. So we'll start with some definitions, and these come from the Government of Canada, from the legislation that has been passed. So medical assistance in dying, or MAiD, is a legal end-of-life care option in which a doctor or nurse practitioner helps a person who is eligible to voluntarily and intentionally end their life. A lot of big words in there, but basically what it means is a doctor or nurse practitioner cannot be legally prosecuted for providing MAiD as long as all the rules are followed. Next slide. So a very brief history of the MAiD process in Canada. There were several decades of legal challenges and political advocacy for the right to die. And there were people advocating on all sides of that debate for many, many years. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada decided to overturn the legal ban on assisted suicide and said that the law needed to be amended. So they put the government on notice that they had to make a change to the law. Previous to this, it was not legal for anyone, including doctors, to help another person to die. In 2016, Canada passed legislation that allowed assisted suicide, which meant that doctors and nurse practitioners can provide medication and oversee a person's death under very strict safeguards. At that time, the safeguards included that the person had to have a terminal illness and be near death. And the process was named medical assistance in dying at that time. Now, keep in mind that assisting somebody to die is different than a withdrawal of care. So if a person is receiving life-sustaining therapy of any type and they choose to stop that therapy, that is very different than medical assistance in dying. Next slide. So in 2021, the MAiD rules were expanded to include people with disabilities or who have medical conditions and are not near death. Now, when we say near death, there's no legal interpretation of what near death means. So doctors have some discretion to determine whether or not a person is near death. But with the 2021 expansion, we saw an increase in discussions amongst the disability community about how this would play out and whether the safeguards that were in place were sufficient to protect people. And in 2023, we expected to see an expansion of MAiD to mature minors, usually would be teenagers, or people with diagnosed mental illnesses. However, that was postponed again because of concerns about safeguards, but these groups are expected to be included in 2024. Because that hasn't happened yet, we're not going to be talking about that specifically today. We're going to be talking about the first two groups that have access to MAiD. Next slide. Okay, so since 2016, roughly 31,664 people have accessed MAiD in Canada, and we've seen that number become larger every year, but we don't have numbers yet to know for sure whether or not the numbers are going up since the 2021 change. So that remains to be seen. In order to be eligible for MAiD in BC, a person has to be eligible for publicly funded health services. So in BC, that would be the MSP program, which pretty much every BC resident is enrolled in. This means that people cannot travel to Canada or to BC to access the MAiD program as part of medical tourism. It is not allowed here. Other countries, such as Switzerland, have had a medical tourism for MAiD or for assisted suicide program for quite a number of years, and that continues in other countries. Every country has done it a little bit differently. But in BC, a person needs to be at least 18 years of age and capable of making decisions about their healthcare. That means legal capacity to understand the decisions and consequences of those decisions. And people need to make a voluntary request for medical assistance in dying. That request cannot be the result of external pressure. So nobody else can force a person into making that request. It must be an independent decision. Next slide. So a few more aspects of eligibility. The person needs to give informed consent. We talk about informed consent a lot in social work and the medical fields. Informed consent means that a person fully understands what they're agreeing to and that they've been given information about the various means that are available to treat their medical condition or that would relieve their suffering, including palliative care options if appropriate. And a few more eligibility things. The person needs to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. This is legal language, big words, basically just means that it's serious and incurable, and that they're in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed, no cure. And this illness, disease, or disability, or state of decline must be causing enduring, ongoing, physical or psychological suffering that the person finds to be intolerable to them. And this suffering is something that cannot be relieved under conditions that the person considers acceptable. So basically, it means that there's no treatment or cure options that the person thinks are going to work for them. Next slide. So there's two current paths to MAiD eligibility. The first one is the one that was approved in 2016. And this is the one where a person is close to death. Again, no specific timeline on that expected death, but this would be people who have an advanced state of incurable cancer or are older and are dealing with age-related conditions and are expected to die within a reasonable time frame, often considered to be 2 years, but that's not in the legislation. Next slide. So the one, and next, yeah, perfect. So the one that is probably of more consideration for our members are people whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable. So these are people who are not dying, but are living with a significant disability. In this case, the person needs to have 2 doctors or nurse practitioners to assess them to make sure that all reasonable means to treat the person's disability or suffering have been discussed with the person, and that the person has given serious consideration to these options. And typically, a person has to have a reflection period of 90 days under this path in order to be eligible for MAiD. This gives a person time to fully decide whether or not their decision is one that they want to follow. Now, the one exception is if a person is likely to lose their ability to consent during that time period, and that likelihood is discussed by the doctors, the person might have a shorter time period to give them the chance to consent on the day that MAiD is experienced. Next slide. So in both cases, whether a person is close to death or not, the person can withdraw their consent at any time up until the time that the medication is administered. And the medical practitioners might request a test of the person's capacity to consent. So this is basically checking to make sure the person understands the consequences of the decision that they're making and that they have the ability to make that decision independently. Next slide. So if a person is interested in learning more about the MAiD program, there are a couple of ways to access it. One option is to speak to your doctor or nurse practitioner, or if you don't have a doctor, you can call the MAiD office in your health authority to discuss it further. And you can either download the request form from the government website, or your doctor will have access to it as well. And that written request, it stands as your written request or interest in the program. You don't need to be able to physically sign the form as long as you can verbally make your wishes known. Next slide. At that point, the person would be assessed by 2 independent doctors or nurse practitioners, who will explain the process, and they will consult to make sure that you fully understand any aspects of your treatment options that might not have been considered yet. This consultation can be done in person or by video conference so that it's available to people who don't have doctors available in their local area or people who find it difficult to travel. And again, no one else can request MAiD on your behalf, even if they're legally allowed to make other healthcare decisions. For example, if a person holds a representation agreement, that allows pretty much all other decision making for healthcare to be made by a family member or friend, whoever's named on that form. That form does not include the right to choose MAiD. That must be done by the person independently. Likewise, if somebody has a power of attorney, that has nothing to do with medical care decision making. That is solely for financial and legal decision making. So you should have those forms filled out for other reasons, but they will not impact a person's ability to access the MAiD program. Next slide. So there's been some ethical considerations that have been brought up by many people on all sides of this debate, and there's a lot of ongoing debate about MAiD. So one of the concerns is that people cannot consent in advance. There's one option to consent in advance if a person is expected to lose that ability very soon, and there's a series of processes a person must go through with the doctor in order to consent in advance, but it's only for when the person is expected to lose that ability very soon. A person can't consent, say 40 years in the future, if they might get dementia when they get older. That is not allowed under the current program. And of course, there's debate on both sides of whether or not that should be allowed. As I've mentioned several times, no one else can consent on your behalf. It means a person has to be able to consent when they're making the request. And it does allow people to choose the time and manner, location of their death, which gives people some choice, and it gives people a little bit of control over when their death happens. Next slide. Now, regarding the enduring and intolerable physical or psychological suffering, this is a really interesting one, and it's the one that probably comes up the most with people with disabilities. Poverty is not one of the legal reasons to be eligible for MAiD. So if a person has a disability and is living in poverty, that in and of itself is not enough to make a person eligible for the MAiD program. However, if a person is suffering because of lack of financial, housing, home care, or other support related to their disability, it is very difficult to separate that from suffering that is more directly related to the disability. And that's where a lot of people have suggested that the program doesn't have enough safeguards for people with disabilities because we don't have enough supports in our society for people with disabilities. So that's one that I think we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this program. And advocates have also raised concerns about a slippery slope because the eligibility has already been expanded once, and it is likely to be expanded next year to two more groups. There are concerns about a slippery slope and also related to that lack of support in our society for disabled people. So there's a lot of aspects to the ethical considerations around MAiD. And again, there's arguments on all sides of this debate, which is why it gets very emotional for a lot of us. And that's why we are talking about it today. Next slide. So these are the discussion questions that we are going to ask Bert and Scott to comment on, but I'll just pause here and ask Terry if there have been any questions in the chat.
One question, so with SCI, you don't have to be terminal then, is that correct?
That is correct. As long as the person feels that they are experiencing that ongoing and significant suffering that's related to their disability.
Okay, and then various people have said they want to access MAiD because they cannot get medical care. Is this a legitimate criteria that MAiD will accept? I mean, you did kind of go over that already, but.
So the answer is no. The suffering has to be directly related to the disability. But as I mentioned, it's very difficult to tease out whether the suffering is related to lack of support versus related to lack of or to the disability itself. It's hard to separate those two things. And that's a very difficult question to answer. I'm not in a legal position to answer that question. Yeah, I would say that if you have questions about that, talk to your doctor or talk to the MAiD office in your area. But I would encourage you to make sure that you've explored all potential support options before making a decision either way about MAiD.
Great. And then we have a couple questions, a few questions that came in from the form. So what protections are there to ensure that people with disabilities aren't making these decisions out of untreated depression or anxiety?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as part of the process, the two independent assessors would make sure or are supposed to make sure that the person has access to the right supports to either receive medication if appropriate, counseling, or other supports available within our system so that when they make a decision either way, they are making it with the full level of support that is available within our system.
So this person says, I don't have much experience, but it seems the care a person needs sometimes doesn't arrive until they sign up for MAiD, and then they jump the long wait lines. This doesn't seem right. I know it's a real medical crisis, not only for those in extreme situations.
Yeah, also a very good point. And I would say that, again, that's a difficult one to answer. I think that's why it's very important that all of us that care about disability issues do as much as we can to advocate for appropriate care, appropriate support, appropriate resources, so that people don't feel forced to make a decision like this.
Mm-hmm. And then the final one is one of the biggest objections I hear to MAiD is the concern that medical providers may encourage their patients to apply for it when they run out of treatments, but aren't interested in MAiD simply because they are hard to treat or not fixable, or that they are a burden to the system. How does the program currently avoid that, or how could we change the program to prevent this?
Yeah, definitely a concern that has been brought up by people. Again, not one that I can answer, but within the program, that's one of the reasons why there's two assessors required for the MAiD program, in the hopes that between the two of them, the person will receive the right support and care options that are available, and that they won't be coerced into the program. And there's a lot of behind the scenes paperwork that I haven't talked about because it's more on the bureaucratic side of things. So there is actually a fair amount of reporting that doctors are required to do when they're working with a person, whether or not they choose to go through with MAiD. They do have to do a fair number of reports. And there are reports made every year as well about how many people access it within a province and within the country.
Thanks, Heather.
And if I could just add to that, there are doctors in our system that are not in agreement with MAiD as well. It may be somebody suggesting that the person consider MAiD, might not be their doctor, could be a family member or else. But again, as Heather alluded to, going through the two doctors or nurses, it's a safeguard to catch that. To catch why are you choosing MAiD? Well, the nurse told me to. So that goes back into the ethical questions around how people are choosing MAiD, or so.
And just to clarify, nurse practitioners, not nurses.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So for Bert and Scott, what are you hearing from peers around this topic? Bert, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sort of what you alluded to. It's just a mixed bag of what people are questioning, and there's two sort of separate groups. There's the people that are interested and been thinking about it and have curious questions about how to go about it, the sort of where do I start questions. And then there's the other group that's totally against it and feels that we're murdering people, and so there's a group of those consistents. And it's different on the phone versus in a coffee group. The people in the coffee group are more to the curious side, whereas the people that are on the phone, they want a little bit more nitty gritty questions about it. The other thing is, there's people that are really serious about MAiD and have been waiting for it to come. And, because of years and years of, it getting shuffled to the background, and they're just waiting for it to come. And, from my experience, those peers, their long-term spinal cord injuries, done every treatment that they think is possible, and have come to that decision because they, goes to that, I can't see anything foreseeable in the future changing my life, and my quality of life is so poor. Just for example, 2 years in bed with a pressure sore, and the families, no family, no support. So quality of their life is so poor that that's sort of a choice that they're making. And so it's right across the board. And social workers have contacted, the Infoline, just sort of asking some questions about, the peers and what's a reasonable expectation of what's their choice is going to be.
And Scott, over to you.
Yeah, the situations that I've had is similar to what Bert mentioned. If I take a phone call, then someone may be interested in MAiD or thinking about it and asking about the process. I always start with people and be completely open and honest with them that I have three distinct and separate point of views that are in my mind. One of them is the professional point of view, which is working for Spinal Cord Injury BC, giving out information that's available, making it available to them, providing it. The second is my personal view on this particular subject. And then there's another one, which would be the biblical or religious considerations that people have for this type of situation. So the people that are calling are people who have sort of, as Bert had said, had a spinal cord injury for decades and have been living with it, and now may be facing changes or difficulties or severe decrease in their independence or ability to deal with the situations that they're now facing, and sort of see no medical intervention or medical procedures or physical procedures or other help that they might be able to get that would be suitable for them. So it's sort of that. And then the other phone calls that I get are from people who have said, I've made the decision, I'm going through the process, I've signed the form, and how has it been put before? My expiration date is coming up, I wanted to let you know. And then we get into some of the discussions and, basically have you made sure that all the final arrangements are made and things like that. So those are the different types of contacts that I've had with people who have either considered this or have gone through it.
And there's a lot of problems. I would say the biggest ones are pain and loss of quality of life are sort of from the people that I've talked to are, they've got pain for the last 35 years. They have gone through all the pain management, all the medications, and nothing works for them. And so they're isolated, and so there's restrictions in their life that allow them to do that. On the other hand, some of the callers are quite young, and for whatever reason, they never accepted the fact that they had a spinal cord injury. They never accepted the fact that they were in a wheelchair. The wheelchair sucks. Like, what kind of life is this? And that takes a little bit more of a challenge, because you have to explain to them what it means to go through the process, and that they won't qualify based on what they're saying. And like Scott was saying, like, I'm of mixed emotions myself. Some days I'm somebody calls you up and you've known them for a bit, and it's I will always say to them, look, I don't want to lose you, but let me be here, through your process with you. And so it's it can be a challenge that way. And the one other thing is that I've known 3 or 4 people that have signed up for MAiD, and they have declined it. One for good. It sounds really good, but when it comes to actually going through with it, I think the human will to live kicks in, and but there's also outside influences where, once, do they disclose to their family or not, is a question I've been asked a few times. The one individual was 100% ready to go ahead with MAiD, filled all the criteria. I agreed with them, their choice, and yet the family was so against it that they sort of guilted him out of it. And or in another instance, 2 of the family members were on board and 2 of them weren't. So because the turmoil that it was creating within the family, the individual sort of had their choice taken away, which leads to another big topic of, what about the people that are left behind? And that's I've had to, I think Scott has as well, talk to family members afterwards that were not at all happy that their sibling or parent had made that choice. So
I think that's one of the things that I've come across with family members, is that the individual who has made the decision, it's come over a very long period of time. And those individuals have had extensive conversations with their loved ones, direct members of their family. They may not have made it known to the public that that's what the direction was that they were taking. I've been to a celebration of life service where it was only made known to friends and acquaintances and things at the celebration of life that the person's passing was because of MAiD. But the family members in general, from the ones that I've spoken to, it was a long process. It was very well thought out and very well considered, and the family in the end concurred with that person's decision to go ahead and stop or go through with MAiD. So yeah, it's usually when individuals call me, they're looking for information, and then we sort of begin the discussion. Again, I tell them my three different points of view, primarily to open up the discussion for them to really explore different aspects. Is this a situational depression that the person's experiencing new deficits or situations that they haven't experienced before and can't control? They're feeling a lack of control. So I'll open up with those three aspects just so that I can fully help them to understand where their decision lies. So
yeah, and I think, you know, one of the other sort of challenges is, you know, in talking to these individuals when they do call, and some of them, you know, they've been talking on and off with them for over 5 or 6 years, and it's, you know, they thought they were ready 6 years ago, and then they, you know, things happen in their lives and they change, and you know, I think they all kind of have hope that the next medicine, the next stem cell is going to pop up just before they've made the choice. So they have a lot of fears that go along with making the choice. And I of the people that I've talked to, MAiD isn't their choice. If there was a cure today for whatever their major thing is, they would definitely not choose MAiD. And you know, there's a couple of the peers that I've known for many years that talked to, had great conversations with, where MAiD wasn't brought up at all. And then 2 weeks later, I receive a call from a family member that they'd chosen MAiD. So there's no way to judge who's considering it or not considering it. So it's not something that I ever bring up in a conversation. It's personally, for the way that our organization, it's not something that we're bringing up. If somebody comes to us that they've chosen MAiD or question MAiD, no matter how much somebody's suffering, and you know, they've been in bed for like 2 months or 6 years or whatever the thing is, I'm never going to bring up MAiD, you know, as a choice. That's something that ethically, I think we're not here to put ideas in people's mind, positive ideas. You know, did you try nature bathing, for example? Or did you try, you know, give them examples of things? But that's also normally by the time they're opening it up to you, they've thought it through and made a decision on their own.
So from what you're hearing from peers, do people think there are enough safeguards under the current rules to protect people?
I think it's probably 50-50. I think that, and there's some people that think that there's too many rules. You should just be able to say, I'm done, call up the doctor 2 weeks from now, that's it. So and then people think that it's about the right amount of safety. I think a lot of people are really concerned when they hear about MAiD. I think that the 2-year, there's a lot of discussion, like you're injured, you can't even look at it for 2 years or 3 years or whatever the thing is, because how many people when they're first injured, I'm not going to live this way. And then, a couple of years, I think we've all been through that, that first little while after your injury, and you're going, oh, what's the point of this? And I have to do that. And then, you get over that, and, you live your life for another 30 years until
I think I'll just jump in there, Bert. Sorry. For the people that I've talked to that are they have made the decision that they're going to be pursuing this, that they're going to be moving ahead. Their issue would be that there's too many safeguards and too many hoops to jump through. They've made that decision and they want to move forward. For others that are, how would I characterize this? Much further back from having to consider this as an option for yourself or themselves, they definitely think that there's not enough safeguards. Family members as well. Anytime this topic's come up sort of in a group setting, it's always around the ethical issues that are involved with it. So it depends on where that person is in this particular process or journey or whatever you want to call it.
If somebody in your peer group is talking about MAiD, whether or not they've made a decision, how do you support the rest of the peer group to navigate through that as a group?
Well, not as a specific group. It's generally in the group session. It's a short conversation. In my experience so far, where it's come up is when one of the group members has gone through with MAiD, and what I generally do as a professional is I will call up and touch base with the peers that were at that group afterwards, just to say, that was a pretty intense discussion. How are you feeling about it? And did you have any other questions or concerns or whatever? And it's sort of just touch base things. I know some of the other groups, copy groups have gone through the same thing, and I've tried to reach out to the leaders and some of the participants of those coffee groups as well, just because it is such a trigger for somebody, especially if you're not on this, that you believe that everybody's choice is their own. But again, you have to respect the person's individual choice. You're not that person. You're not living their life. And so in a group situation, there's one time where, everybody's saying, how can we convince you to change your mind? And so that's really hard on the person who's disclosed that they've made that choice. And so then you have to, change the discussion and to kind of explain, everybody's different and everybody's tolerance levels are different, and what you may be able to handle, say, pressure sore in bed for 6 months, that might not bother you because you've got Netflix. But if you've had that pressure sore for a year and a half and you're 80 years old and there's no chance that it's ever going to heal, and you've been told that, then you try to make it a compassionate plea for that individual, and that's really challenging too, because again, in a lot of cases, people that and you don't want to lose them from your life. And the alternative is,
Go ahead.
Sorry, Scott, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I wanted to agree with the point. It's when the discussion comes up, it's always prefaced by the fact that we're going to have the discussion with openness, respect, and no judgment. Way back when this was first starting to come out, I think it was 2016, possibly earlier, the conversation was beginning to come up quite a bit. And so within a number of people that I was working with, we started a group here called Final Stages. Now, that's probably a bit of a misnomer, because Final Stages was originally formed as a peer group for people to talk about and find solutions for remaining as independent as you possibly can throughout the aging process and getting very advanced in years. So it was all about getting information of how to stay independent and how to continue to manage as you were aging. What came up in the group obviously was MAiD, as it was beginning to ramp up, and representation agreements and power of attorneys and things like that. So we did different seminars about those kinds of issues too. So, but it was a situation where we were able to start talking about this. And then when someone came and said that they would like to consider it, then I would refer them to the group so that we could all talk together. Every one of us in the group, because we all did the paperwork. We went through the paperwork to find out what the legalities are, what the paperwork was like and everything. And as we were filling those out, all of us came to the decision is this is really hard to know when that end trigger point was, that we would say, okay, we're going to flip the switch and make this decision. Maybe those are really bad metaphors, but that we would initiate this process through to its conclusion. It was a very, very tough challenge. So as Bert was saying before, when somebody has made that decision to carry forward, it's a long road to making that decision, and there's tons of variables involved.
Yeah,
and I guess that's where we have to try to help people to give them the information, which can be difficult based on a recent experience I had, but also that we're teasing out some of the other peripheral issues that may be influencing them. Go ahead, Bert.
Yeah, and I would add, what Heather said a while ago about the paperwork and getting everything done. That is a sort of a checkpoint too, because it is, for some people, that's just daunting. For some people, they can't go online. They don't have the able to emotionally or whatever it is to go online and find the forms, or to, they don't have, they're kind of embarrassed to go talk to their doctor about that, because there's the stigma of being judged that you're giving up, or you're being, you're whining about that issue. And in a lot of cases, when you've got that point with your doctor, you already feel like your doctor's done with you and is just going through the motions to get you to when you come back to another appointment. And again, myself struggling right now as not having a doctor, just to get a urine sample done, is that you go to emergency for that. So to have somebody have to make this very, very difficult case or decision in their life, and then having these additional hurdles, that maybe if they were able to go to the doctor and have their opinion heard, that might sway their decision not to, just the fact that somebody's listening to them. And I think Scott and I were talking about it the other day, that some people have just burnt out everybody around them, and the doctors included. And then if they can talk to one of us, whether it be a coffee group leader or just one of the other peers, that'll sit and listen to them and actually, you know, it's the whole being there thing that, you know, if somebody wants to talk to you about an issue, you probably had that issue, and you know, that gives you, you know, you're not trying to sway them and you're not trying to tell them not to do it, but it might give them a little bit more strength to you know, endure a little bit more. But there becomes a point where, for the most part, the people that I talk to, they've come to the end of where they want to be. They've lived a good life, and I'll tell you, several of them are multi-millionaires that have made this choice. So it's not a financial thing. It's not a financial decision. It's not. It's a personal reflection of how much, you know, if you're looking at another, you know, the last 30 years have been X, and the next, you know, there's no hope for change in the next, and you don't have the quality of life, then that decision's made, and it's not my role to talk them out of it.
Well, I think one of the other things that we'd like to, you know, let everybody know is that should you have a friend or a loved one who's going through this, or considering it, or has had the procedure done, that Bert and Heather are available through the Infoline to talk to and discuss. And through the Infoline, I'm available too. You can call me and discuss with us, and sort of debrief the situation too. So we're very open to hearing from people to help guide them through too, or walk with them through, not necessarily guide, but walk with them through it.
Thank you, Scott. And that's actually a perfect segue into the final few minutes, where we're going to talk about some of the supports and resources that are available. So Terry can put up the next slide. And we want to reiterate that we know that this is a tough topic, that people have very widely differing opinions and emotions about it. And it's something that we struggle with as well, both professionally and personally. It's just a tough topic. So some of you might be feeling pretty emotional after this conversation today, and you might need a listening ear. So as Scott said, we do have a few options to talk to us or to talk to your peers about these topics. So next slide, please. So the first option is the information line. The number and email are up there. And there's 3 of us who answer the phones and emails, who are all well trained to understand these issues and to understand the complexity of the decision making that people might be experiencing, or the conflicting emotions that people might be going through. We also have a very strong peer support program across the province. So you can either call up your local peer coordinator that you already know, or if you don't know your local peer coordinator, call the information line listed above, and we will either find you your closest peer contact or somebody else that is appropriate for you to talk to. Our role, as Scott said, is not to tell you what to do. Our role is to listen, to support, to make sure that you're connected with the right resources, the right information, so that you can make an informed decision and deal with any emotions that are coming up as you're going through this process, no matter what your final decision is. There are also support resources available from family, friends, professional counselors, and we will be sending out a resource list after this webinar, which lists a number of options across the province. Some are paid resources, and many of them are low cost or free, but definitely feel free to call us first for anything that's come up, because we do understand how difficult this topic is. And we'll end it there. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate your interest in learning the facts about this topic, as well as some of the ethical considerations and the emotions that people are experiencing. Terry, back to you.
Thanks, Heather. There was one more question, actually a couple of questions that did come in. One, I don't know if you're able to answer though, but I will ask anyways. If you are nonverbal, how does one give consent?
So it's my understanding that there are different ways to give consent. If you'd like, I can look it up after this to find out the exact wording in the legislation. I can pass the information to Terry and she can send out the answer with the resource list so that everybody who has that question can get that answer.
And then I know we mentioned this before, but just a comment that there's maybe religious factors that are extremely painful in considering this as well. And we did talk about that a little bit earlier, Scott mentioned. Question, are the people inquiring new injuries are inquiring about MAiD new injuries or people who are struggling with aging or other secondary medical issues?
Both. Usually, in my experience, it's people who have been injured for a while and are experiencing secondary complications or changes or are aging, one of those things. Typically not people who are newly injured. Either we're not hearing it directly or people aren't asking. But I think our staff at GF Strong might have a different answer on that.
Just want to thank everybody for attending today's session. I hope that you found it to be informative. And really a big shout out to Heather, Bert, and Scott, because this is a really difficult conversation. And I know it stirs up a lot of emotions for a lot of people. So really appreciate your openness and vulnerability and sharing of experiences. I think it really helped people. And also, please know that we're all here for you. So I don't know about many of you, but brings up emotion for me in talking about it. So, reach out to Heather, Bert, Scott, any of us, if you want to be able to talk more, especially after this session. So thank you all so much.